Welcome to the Be Well at USask podcast with me, Peter Headley. In each episode, members of the USask and wider community will join me to share ideas and provide guidance on all aspects of being well. And we'll be highlighting campus initiatives and resources designed to engage and support you. In these challenging times, we hope the ideas and information we share will help. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Lisa Greig, who's a social worker and works as an outreach coordinator in the Student Affairs and Outreach team at the university. Lisa and I are going to be talking about the realities of bereavement, grief, and loss. Well, welcome to the podcast, Lisa. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Peter.
So can you start off telling me a little about your background and the work that you do now at the university supporting students?
Sure. So my background's social work. I've got both my undergraduate and graduate degrees in social work, and I work on campus with student affairs as a student support and outreach coordinator. So that is my current role, but I think the other part of it is behind the scenes in the community. I'm very passionate about the work of death, dying, grief, and loss, actually. And so I find myself volunteering and consulting for organizations such as Prairie Hospice, and also pre-COVID would be running death cafes in the city about twice a year.
So you might not actually be aware of this, but even before we met for the first time, while you were interviewing for the job, I became aware of you because somebody sent me a link to the TED Talk or the TEDx talk that you did in 2015, I think it was. And I really liked the talk, and I was really excited that you'd be joining the team. But just to share with the listeners who may not have seen the talk, it was entitled Lisa Greig is Dying, but then again, so are you, which was a little bit of a surprise. So why the choice of topic of death to discuss?
Well, I think when it comes to even, applying and finding out that TEDx was coming to Saskatoon, because that's where I did that, it needs to be something not just catchy, but interesting. And as a presenter, obviously something you're passionate about because you want to bring that to the stage. And so for me, that was kind of a no-brainer. As I share even through my talk, I grew up in a bit of a death-obsessed family where there were no limits on what we talked about. We talked about everything. And I just found that theme throughout my lifetime, just in the work I did and where I went. And I went into social work truly wanting to focus on areas of grief and loss. And so this theme became a pattern. And when there came an opportunity to do a TEDx talk, I thought, well, I might as well just keep going with that same theme and the whole context of our own mortality. And rather than being afraid of it, maybe we need to do the work on accepting it so we can live better lives.
Yeah, well, for me, it was just interesting to actually have someone tackle something like that in a very practical way. And so when you talked about your family life, that was a really, really interesting thing. So, well, there isn't anything we can't talk about, which is pretty unusual.
Exactly. So, Peter, I guess before we dive into the rest of the conversation, something that I wanted to bring up with you is when we talk about death and dying and grief and loss, I know this is a topic that's also important and very personal to you. And so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about that and why, because I think it helps set the framework for our listeners.
Sure. Well, I guess the most significant thing is when I was 12 years old, I lost my mum, Paula, to cancer. So she'd battled cancer for quite a number of years. She was 40 when she died. And so that was a really significant moment in my childhood. And I guess I don't even look at it necessarily as childhood. It felt like childhood stopped there. Yeah. And when I was 20, just as I was starting my final year of undergraduate studies, one of my stepsisters, Helen, passed away as a result of a car accident. And she was just 23. So she'd just finished university and was just starting to think about her future and train as a nurse as the next step, I think. And I think in my time I've lost all of my grandparents, and that happened many, many years ago. But all of these were events that had a really profound impact on my life and the lives of my family, but also my identity and the journey since then and my perspectives on the world. And so I'm always interested to hear what people's perspectives are, if they have them. But I also find that people get really uncomfortable when it comes to talking about the idea of death or dying and bereavement, even spending time with people who've been bereaved. And really after thousands of years, it seems weird, doesn't it, that it's still really taboo. And so I'm keen to have conversations when we can. Do you think that's right? I mean, am I right to say it's still taboo? And if that's right, why is that?
Oh, absolutely, Peter. And thank you, by the way, just kind of for sharing that personal story of your own,
Yeah,
because I think it just goes to like the first part of it all about the ironic, I guess, if that's the right word, part of it being taboo is it's universal. Loss is universal. And death loss especially is something that we all experience. Anytime that I've done death cafes or even gone into the classrooms where I've done some presentations, if I'm doing it on grief and I ask people by a show of hands, raise your hands if you here have experienced a death loss, and 99% of the hands go up because everybody has experienced it. And so the whole part of it being taboo is, I don't know why we think that if we talk about it, it's going to happen to us, or, it makes us deeply uncomfortable. And I'm not sure exactly what that's about, but I think the emotions that come up in us, it's just super uncomfortable to really face our mortality. And I think we'll get into this a little bit later, but COVID-19 has brought that right to the forefront for many of us, that, it doesn't discriminate on age. And, suddenly people are really facing their own mortality. And whenever we do that, we become deeply uncomfortable and we try to run as far away from that as we can.
One of the things I appreciate in your TED Talk, and we'll post the link to the TED Talk in the podcast details, is you talk about the real practicalities, like end of life practicalities, which made me go, oh, and I forget the phrase that you use. What is the phraseology for the particular thing you discussed?
Like the advanced healthcare directives?
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say. And it was something that made me go, oh, I mean, like, we have a will, but like, do we need to talk about the fact that I don't want Bon Jovi played at the funeral?
Why not? No.
But I think it is that sense of, but that's awful. That's pessimistic. You don't want to go there. But even in my own life experience, as a parent, like, I go there in my head a lot, like what ifs. And I know
the foreboding joy that comes with parenthood.
Yeah. And, I think it's because of my own personal experience of having lost a parent as well. But also, I don't know. Like, we don't know. And those practical things that will matter. And I like the fact that you talk about, well, let's just save some time and let's do this for an hour now. So I really appreciate that perspective, the practicality of it's coming for all of us.
It is. And I think the whole piece about advanced healthcare directives, again, it's for everybody of all ages. And I love how you even just talked about your own funeral and not wanting it to be Bon Jovi, because I think there is the true medical component of it, right? About, are you do not resuscitate? What does that mean to you? What are the levels of it? What do you want should you go into hospital? Like, those are the very practical pieces of an advanced healthcare directive that I actually believe that we all should have at all of our ages. But then there's also, I mean, for me, I call it fun. Other people call it morbid. But what do we want at the end of our life? Do we want it to be a celebration? Don't we? Because if we don't look into that, we are leaving that to the people in their grief. And again, I think it's way easier for us to plan our own funeral than it is for those left in, it's a harsh word, but left in our devastation to try and make some of those decisions on our behalf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, maybe getting a little bit more into this sort of question of people who are left behind. So when we talk about grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying is still the key text and rightly credited with changing a lot of attitudes towards the terminally ill. So the key model outlines the 5 stages of grief, which is obviously a series of emotions that it's mapped out that are experienced by terminally ill patients. Or prior to their death. So, but also associated with people who've lost a loved one. So that's around those 5 things which I'll ask you to talk about. But what does that model look like, and what value or usefulness is there for people who are in grief?
Well, I think that this is probably where I should always say, like, rant alert when I go and talk about this. My students, I taught a death and dying class, and I think they were so used to this. But Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, first of all, her work is amazing and it set the foundation, for our work in grief and loss. But when she did this, it was about the stages of dying, right? And it was with their own death that they were reconciling with. And so often now people took that model and they put it into grief, assuming that grief, as we love to think, ties up neatly into a package of 5 stages, which for those of you who aren't familiar would be denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And we don't go through those 5 stages one after the other. But just because it's about the stages of dying and not the stages of grief, it doesn't mean that you don't go through those. And like I sit down with clients all of the time and I say, you could feel all of them at once. You could feel none of them. But so often I have people that are like, okay, so I'm really angry right now. When do I get into the bargaining stage? And as you know firsthand, Peter, grief is not a linear process. And I think this work of Kubler-Ross, what we really have to recognize is carrying it forward. It's a template. It's to recognize that grief is hard. It is messy. These are things that we can feel. We can feel all of them. We can feel none of them. But it's not the stages as what was interpreted by many for it to be.
Yeah, I think that's something that I found valuable as a thought over time, and I guess I should say because I probably didn't get some of the care that I needed at the time. Often when you're particularly young, or then you don't always do that, and it was only later where the recognition came as to what had happened. And you're right. I mean, you can read about those stages and and say, oh, okay, I understand that happened. I think we can sometimes struggle with that idea. Why am I not feeling this?
Mm-hmm.
Or other people think that I should be feeling this. Why am I not in tears all day long? And I think that level of expectation or self-expectation can be quite harmful. People living through the aftermath of someone passing away, but I think also it's not always someone we know. What is that experience that we sometimes have where it's not someone we know and we expect that we feel a certain way, or we surprise ourselves that we feel a certain way by the passing because it makes a connection, it triggers something for us? What does that look like in your experience?
Oh, grief. It just speaks to how it just infiltrates all parts of us. And I think the first thing that we need to know with grief when we're feeling it is just to allow it to enter us, give it the space that it needs, and, acknowledge where it's coming from. And relationships are tricky and they are complicated. And so grief is often the result of the ending of a relationship, and complicated relationships can mean complex grief, or they cannot. It's really hard to say, but I think just because we witness or we experience the death loss of somebody that maybe wasn't as close to us, it doesn't mean that we're not entitled to experience that grief. And I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were getting at, Peter, but
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's partly about the expectation, but things that can surprise us. I know that I still find myself surprised, really moved by certain things that really catch me off guard. And this is like 30 years after my mother died. And I think some of those things are other people's emotions and pain. Like it's just like a direct line into my sort of emotional core that I feel that. And so whilst I sometimes struggle with this idea of, this phraseology of being triggered,
yes.
just being that sense of overwhelming empathy for something that you feel of someone else. But as you say, that's legitimate and it's positive, like it's the best part of humanity that we have this empathy, because if we don't, but then also not getting on your own case if you don't feel that thing,
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we struggle with humanity in general, is just to kind of allow ourselves to be what we are in that moment. And, emotions are going to get triggered us for all different reasons. And, when we have the space and the time to unpack what that is, great. But I find that, lately with all of us kind of being quarantined and self-isolated, we've had maybe more time to unpack certain things and it's slowed life down a bit. But the fast pace of life hasn't helped us in confronting some of these very difficult emotions, and grief being one of them. I mean, when we look at those who are in the acute phases of grieving and going through it, they're so quick to try and get back to normal that they're not even giving themselves the space to just acknowledge where they're at and recognize that it's a new normal that they're actually trying to work towards.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true, and certainly in my experience. And I guess we should acknowledge that the nature of the death and the age of the person and the circumstances around it can play a significant role in a person's response to it. So for me, my mother's death was following a long period of illness. And that was very different from my stepsister's death, which was sudden and completely unexpected. I was woken up one morning by my housemate at university because my dad was on the phone. And so the circumstances were so very different. The emotions were so different, and both awful in their own way.
Yes.
Can you share a little about how those circumstances affect us and our reaction?
Absolutely. And I think with grief, we're always trying to make sense of it. And I often say with clients, we're trying to take grief and we're trying to put it in a box, and it just won't fit in that box. And so we try to explain to ourselves, okay, if this happened, it's better or it's worse. And recognizing that first, there's no hierarchy to grief in the sense of, loss is loss, death is death. And if it was hard for you, it's hard. But recognizing that certain deaths are going to impact us differently. Death by suicide is very, very complex and complicated because often people are looking for reasons and understanding, and they can't get that. But at the same time, maybe those people who've grieving the death of a terminal illness, while they may have had chance to say goodbye, sometimes the length of that illness can be very, very devastating to the person as well. The age of the person who's died. And again, this is where I contradict myself, where I say there's no hierarchy to grief. But what I do know is that the death of a child is, one of the most unimaginable deaths and griefs that a person can experience. It's those out of order deaths. I expect to lose my grandparent before my parent, before my sibling, before my child. But when those deaths happen out of order, that can also complicate our grief process as well.
Yeah, and I think that thinking as you say about a death by suicide, that's also tied up with lots of feelings of guilt from people who have survived, and examining what are some practical pieces of advice that you would have with people dealing with the aftermath of a death by suicide, either within their own family or friendship group or community?
In my experience, what I've found to be so helpful is we always label as survivors of suicide in relation to those who are grieving. So the grievers who have survived the loss of somebody who's died from suicide, is if they can gather together, because I think our losses are best recognized by those who have experienced a similar loss. And so there are incredible suicide support groups for those who've experienced that kind of loss. And a lot of participants have shared that it was so helpful to have other people who understand that form of grief. But my quick advice is always, and it's always easier said than done, but it's not your fault, and to ask for help. And the more that we break down the barriers and stigma of mental health and mental illness, and trying just to explain things that can't be explained, and that often comes with death by suicide, the more that I think we're going to give voices to people who need to share their experiences. But again, it's complicated. And I think as the griever, it's just having that courage when you're ready to reach out and ask for help. And when you are the listener, and I say the listener because we don't need to be giving advice and we don't need to be fixing these people, but just when you're the listener, to really hold that space to allow the person to share how they're feeling and to allow them to finish their full sentence before you try to take away the blame, because they need to get to the other side. And the only way to get to the other side is to go through.
Yeah, no, those are all really great points. I think one of the other things in my experience has been just to be there for somebody. And I don't just mean at the end of the phone. I mean to be able to be present with someone, which is tricky right now, I understand. But not to feel you have to talk. You don't have to share. You don't have to find the answers. You don't have to fix. But just to be present with that person, just that reassurance has been important in my lifetime, of just friends who've showed up. And they kind of end up being a bit of a pain in the ass sometimes. They keep showing up, but it's
right?
good for you. Like they
hopefully, hopefully with a casserole or something too, right? That
Yeah,
people
well,
always bring food when
exactly.
people
I think
die.
it's just that. But I think sometimes being able to be present with someone and actually to be comfortable with the lack of comfort, and to know how painful it is, the pain that somebody's going through, but just to be able to be there and just keep coming back. Because in my family, I know what we found was that people are there and they're amazing whilst all the practicalities and the drama are happening, and then afterwards it just goes quiet and people get a little uncomfortable because there's not practical things to do. And my advice, just keep coming back to those people, keep checking in with them, because I think that is the crucial period in the aftermath when it goes quiet, when they really need you. But you just got to be comfortable with that discomfort, I think. And that's what I've found, given my own experience, I'm pretty comfortable with, of just being able to be in that space. So maybe that's a good segue, actually. I mean, I think when we lose people, we often start searching for meaning. And that's something you and I have talked about a little before. How have you supported people in navigating this exploration of sense or meaning following a death, especially when there seems to be no meaning at all? It's so senseless.
Oh, it's, it has to be led by the griever first and foremost. It's not, our job, and our job being the friend, the family member, the therapist, whatever our role is. It's not our job to find meaning in the loss for the other person. And I think that that's one of the biggest mistakes that we often make is we love that when someone's sharing their grief and their hurt, because we are so uncomfortable, like you said, suddenly it's, well, they're in a better place now, or everything happens for a reason. And all of those things that, like, if I could just, I wish I could walk around with like an air horn every time someone says that and just set it off, because it's not okay to say those things. But just, we love to try and find the meaning for the other person so we can speed up their grief to get them to the other side, when in fact that's their journey. And so, and it takes the longest. And David Kessler right now, he worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, but he just put out a book, Meaning Making: The Sixth Stage of Grief. And it's an amazing book. And he has some great interviews on right now that I would encourage anyone who's grieving or not grieving to listen to. But just that process of finding meaning, and to recognize that it's going to start bubbling up when you least expect it. You don't necessarily have to go on a meaning hunt, but sometimes you're going to do something and you're just going to maybe notice in the exhale that today felt better and you did something for that person. Continuing bonds is a great example that often I work with students on, where how do we honor that person? And just by finding ways to honor that person, we can find meaning in that relationship, not necessarily meaning in the death. And I want to differentiate those two, because often people say, like, what, you want me to make a meaning as to why this person died too young? Absolutely not. But maybe we can continue to find meaning in that relationship you had, as opposed to now you have this huge void in your life where that person no longer exists.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate those thoughts, particularly around the relationship piece. And for me, it's always been interesting looking at, so why did this happen? Why did this happen to me in my life? Am I the victim of this thing that happened, or is there something else? And I think I've always tried to look at the value that I've gained from not only, for example, my mother's life, but also her death. Like, what did that give me that other people do not have? And it's not quite a superpower, but it gives you a very different perspective on the world and mortality. And I've found that with the places that I've looked for meaning have come much later when I look at what I'm doing in my life now. So my mother was a nurse, and I have no health training at all. That's not my background. I'm pretty good at putting on a stretchy bandage on my son. I was doing that in the last couple of days, but I can do hospital corners on a bed as well. But I find myself working in health and mental health and well-being. And how did that happen? And so it's obviously something in my DNA, but also the journey that I've taken that I would otherwise have not taken. And I often reflect upon that. I was talking to one of my sons recently, and they're very aware. I talk to them about, their grandmother, who they will never know, and that's heartbreaking in a different way for me. But there's so much of her in them, I see. And I said to one of them, well, you mustn't feel sad because of her life, you are here. And one of my sons, who I think was 7 at the time, he said, and because of her death, we're here. And it was just like, oh my God, it's just
right
like
from the
so
mouths of
profound
babes.
because he's right. Like the world changed in a certain moment and so sent me in a different direction. Yeah. And so I think I often think about this idea of these sort of ripples, or sort of, a stone drops into the water and the ripples come away. And I think they do have a way of passing across time, these ripples, and influencing things to make the world better. And I think we can sometimes lose that. And it's not the empty platitudes of, oh, it happened for a reason. Because as you say, you don't need that. It doesn't help anyone. And I understand why we sometimes do that, particularly in religious circles, that is sometimes done. But I think, as you say, we can find those pieces of meaning. And I find them in my life all the time. But you should probably not try too hard, not too early to look for those things. Because I think that's one of the difficulties. Yeah.
And like just a little bit too of like what I'm hearing you're touching on, Peter, is like that whole legacy building piece, right? I think so often, we think about what kind of legacy do we want to leave behind, but also it's also honoring the legacy of the person who's died and just sharing the story about your mom and how you've honored that legacy of healthcare into what you're doing now. And I hear that a lot. And even in my own grief, I think we've all gone through various forms of loss, but my university basketball coach of 5 years died after I finished playing for her of cancer. And it's always so interesting the ways that she will continue to bubble up in my life as I continue, or even when I made a return back to post-secondary education, and just honoring that legacy and what we do with that can also help us find meaning.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm not saying to be senselessly positive about a loss, because that's a hard thing to do. But I think it is that perspective. And as you say, and actually appreciating and reflecting back. And I think that's what the person gave to you. That is the gift that is passed on. But it takes time to get to that point. And I'm 30 years on and I'm still grappling with some of those pieces and, in those kind of cases. But I have to make sense of that within my own lifetime, And I think something very strange happened when I turned 40, which was the age that my mother died. And on the day of my birthday in the evening, completely unexpectedly, I just burst into tears. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I knew exactly what it was about, but it had clearly been playing on my mind that was a key moment. And there was something so strange to me about arriving at that moment in my own lifetime. So I think these things can creep up on us. So it's not easy. I'm not suggesting that. But most
so
days,
normal, Peter. Yeah, but so normal. And I think that you sharing that story and even speaking to time 30 years later, grief does not know time. And we have this pressure. The number one question I get asked whenever I'm providing grief support or grief counseling is, how long will this last? And, that's when I have to break the bad news where I'm like, well, there's no timeline, but also forever, because that person isn't coming back. But what we know about grief is it changes over time and it gets lighter. That's kind of the best way that I use to describe grief. It doesn't go away. That hole that you feel is still there. Or for those people who have complicated loss, I mean, we've just been sharing about losses and death losses of people who've been important to us. But there's a lot of people who've had very negative or horrible relationships with people who have died, and that complicates their grief. Yeah. And that's okay. It's okay to be relieved when somebody dies, but then you have guilt for that. And I find more often than not, when I'm sitting with people in that space, is I'm really normalizing almost every single thing that they express, and not to placate them, but because it's normal.
Well, and I guess maybe I should just to touch upon that, but this is people coming for support. And so when you say things get easier, I think that's particularly true if you seek the supports that you need. And I know that's not easy, and particularly for men to say I'm struggling here and I need to be vulnerable and share. That's really not easy. But I think for some people, if they don't do some of that work, and connecting with a professional who can really see things and help and guide, and whether that's individual treatment or whether that could be a group, a family, because as you say, things are complex, then I think if some of that work is not done, it does not necessarily get easier. It actually just gets painful with time in a different way. And so I think that, I definitely encourage anyone, and I know that you'd say the same, to just try it.
Yeah.
I've talked to more than one counselor. Not everyone has been a great fit. I didn't do it when I was young. It came later. But not everyone was a great fit. But don't dismiss the idea that that somebody could be helpful. Try and get
Yeah.
a recommendation from someone who specializes, particularly in grief and loss, and give it a try. But also give it another try if the first person isn't a great fit for you. I found talking to a man easier. But
Yeah.
that's not necessarily right for all men or women and women. I think it's just finding someone you click with.
I think that that's so important, though, Peter. And I think, too, it just speaks to, again, it's not uncommon to get stuck in our grief, and you're probably going to get stuck multiple times, but we don't want you to stay stuck. And that's where reaching out for help and reaching out to a professional can be very beneficial. And again, a professional doesn't have the magic wand and doesn't have this big solution, or we're not keeping these secrets as to how to get through grief, but it's just that space where you can be completely vulnerable and share what you need to share with no judgment. And you're right. The first person may not be the best fit. And it's really hard when it took you all the courage in the world to finally reach out, and then you go sit down and you meet that person and you don't click. I just can't emphasize enough to just pick up that phone and try again and request somebody different then, or maybe try a group or whatever that looks like to help get you through that process. I completely agree, though, Peter. I think it is very beneficial.
Yeah, and so with that view in mind, particularly the sort of the group piece, what can you tell me about the Grief 101 program that you run at the university, and who can attend and what's involved?
Yeah, so the Grief 101 group was a bit of a passion project. So I'm still grateful that when I pitched the idea that I was completely supported and told to go for it. And even, I mean, I don't want to say like, yay, people came, because that's, they brought their sadness, but I was so grateful for the group after group of students that showed up every single week to come. And it's designed for students on campus who have experienced a death loss. And we've even done it, I went more specific to the death loss of a person. And I don't ever want to discount the loss of a pet, because I know pets can be just like family to some people. But I also know in grief support groups, comparing the loss of a parent to the loss of a dog doesn't go well in the grief circles. I just know this. And so I'm not saying that one is more valuable than the other, but it is for the death loss to support students on campus. And again, the students came and they just shared. I just was blown away actually every single week how they came together to share their own stories, but also support each other, and how the space was there for them just to be however they were that day. And every week was different. Some weeks we approached the death anniversaries of maybe their person, or maybe it was the birthday of their person. And, regularly they did share with me, they're like, I'm so glad that this space was here, because no matter what mask I had to put on today to get to class, to do the lab, to talk to my friends, I knew that when I walked through these doors, I could take off the mask, and however I was, I was. And so if I wanted to be an asshole, I could be that respectfully. If I wanted to cry, I could. If I wanted to just be quiet, I wouldn't be judged or asked what was wrong with me, because it's just assumed that I'm grieving. And I credit so much of the success of that group to, the way that the students showed up every single week.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate their work, and I know across the teams we do that you've created that kind of space, because I think we do need to acknowledge what's happening in people's lives beyond their studies, and we're increasingly doing so, but so that people have lives and feelings. And I'm glad you mentioned the distinction between sort of animals and humans in terms of loss, because I think for many young people at university for the first time, we need to acknowledge that they may be young to the point, if they haven't experienced that kind of tragedy in their own lives, even grandparents, that it is likely to come from a pet, or if you live on a farm, sort of an animal, or an important animal in that environment. It's not just human beings we're talking about. Those emotions are very, very similar.
They are. They're like, again, it's a relationship, right? And for some people, that pet or that animal has been their support, their primary support for years. And to lose that is so significant. And so not for them to discount, though, their emotions either. And it's okay to reach out and ask for help to talk about that too. Again, grief doesn't discriminate between humans and animals, that's for sure.
No, and I really appreciate that, just that permission to pick up the phone or to come in. And so is the grief group is something that you're going to be running in the new academic year, is that right?
That's something I hope to. I hope to get the virtual platform up and going so that we can continue offering the support to students, because again, the grief doesn't change, and so we need to be able to be there to support our students.
So I know we've talked quite a bit about sort of practical tips, but are there any other bits of advice that you would offer when it comes to if you're working through grief and loss yourself or supporting someone who is that we haven't talked about?
I think we've touched on all the big things, Peter, but to keep it really simple, Megan Devine is such a leader right now in providing grief support. And her biggest tips right now for how to support a grieving friend or person is just show up, listen, don't fix. And I think that that's just what we need to always tuck in our back pocket, right? Show up. So like you were saying, whether it's in person, if we're allowed to be, or on the phone, or just sending that text message, being there, listening, we don't need to be talking. We just need to hold that space. Silence is more uncomfortable for us, and it's okay for us to be uncomfortable in the silence. And then don't fix. I remind the grievers all the time that you are not broken. You're not broken. This is just something that has happened. And so you need to get through this. You need to go through this, however long it takes you. And for those people supporting, your job isn't to come in and put on the cape and rescue and fix. Just hold the space and be there and listen. And then for those grieving, I think, again, for the bulk of our grievers, you're normal. And to know that there's going to be good days, good moments, but they're going to change all of the time. And that's perfectly normal too. You talked about the ripple effect of loss, but I think it's also the ripple effect of grief too. And it's like looking at the waters, right? Some days it's calm and that's how you feel. And then some days it feels like the storm and the tides and everything are just rolling in and the waves are crashing in on you and it's hard to catch your breath. And grief is the same, and it's moment to moment.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found useful is just even when there's a struggle, to be honest with other people, is to try and be honest with how you're doing, and I think that piece about having someone neutral to talk to, and that's difficult because most of us don't really have those people, which is where professionals, given their experience too, are so valuable. And so, if there are students who are struggling at this time, or even in the future with grief and loss, how can they connect with you and the wider team?
I think the best thing right now is actually just calling the main number, so 306-966-5757, and we'll be able to direct you where you need to go. And I think that that's still the best place. Otherwise, you can always send an email to the student outreach email address, student.outreach@usask.ca.
So one of the things I'm asking all guests on the podcast to share is one thing that they're doing to be well right now, perhaps something that brings them joy or a sense of connection. What would that thing be for you, and how do you find it helps?
Oh, that's such a great question, because I think at the beginning of this pandemic, the answer was nothing, and that wasn't good. And so I think it's about establishing a routine. Movement is so important to me, and I go to the local bar studio, and now that it's opened up again, going to classes in person, socially distanced, it creates that sense of community that is so necessary for me, even as an introvert. But it's finding that balance between, recharging your batteries, but also seeking that community connection. But movement is definitely a big one, in routine.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And so is there a final thought that you'd want to leave listeners with, either what we've been talking about today or something in general?
I think it's just always okay to reach out for help. I think, please give yourself the permission you need to feel however it is that you're feeling. And don't hesitate to reach out if you've got more questions, or if listening to this brought up something in you that you want to talk out further. I think that's, just reach out, ask, get a hold of us. And Peter, I just can't thank you enough for doing this. Actually, I think you've brought forth so many rich conversations and have created such a great platform for people to connect in a time where, it can feel so disconnected. And I think that something like this is really important.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. No, I mean, I think I've gained way more from the conversations like today and on other days than I think anyone else has. So no, I really appreciate all of your enthusiasm for what is, for a lot of people, a tough area. I'm grateful for your family being open and doing all the sharing and the interest that's brought forward and for you taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Thanks for listening to the Be Well at USask podcast with me, Peter Headley. Thanks again to Lisa for joining me and sharing. For anyone experiencing grief and loss or supporting someone who is, please reach out to the team or access the resources listed in the podcast details. Please subscribe and share this podcast. You can find us on multiple platforms, including Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Since this is the last episode in Season 1, I want to express my sincerest thanks to all the guests who participated in this season for their time and sharing. Special thanks to Jocelyn Orb and Tracy Spencer, who guest hosted some fantastic episodes, to our designers, Leanne Lauren and John Schelling, and our communications specialist, Megan Syred. And an extra special thanks to the producer of the podcast, Wayne Giesbrecht, and the USask media production team, without whom none of this would be possible. We'll be back soon with Season 2 with more guests, ideas, and guidance on all aspects of being well. So until then, stay safe and be well.